how manufacturers are dealing with tariff threats, the case for resiliency, and the new fees levied on Chinese cargo ships. Pull up a chair and join us as the editors of DC Velocity discuss these stories as well as news and supply chain trends on this week's Logistics Matters podcast. Hi, I'm Dave Maloney. I'm the Group Editorial Director at DC Velocity. Welcome. Logistics Matters is sponsored by ID Label. Have a new warehouse project, WMS conversion, reconfiguration, or a new facility? ID Label is here to help. ID Label manufactures durable labels and signs for your warehouse, and their in-house team also installs them. Visit idlabelinc.com to request a free label sample pack for your next project. ID Label, when we do the barcodes, you can do more. As usual, our DC Velocity senior editors Ben Ames and Victoria Kickham will be along to provide their insights into the top stories of this week. But to begin today, recent surveys show that both consumers and business leaders don't think that tariffs are a good thing. In both cases, they feel this economic policy is dooming us to higher prices and a recession. Manufacturers in particular are trying to figure out what to do next. And our guest today looks at the impacts of the changing U.S. trade policies on manufacturing. Here is Ben with our guest. Ben?
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, we've certainly seen a lot of changes in U.S. trade policies in recent weeks, with the White House threatening tariffs, delaying them, sometimes boosting them again. But whether specific countries or specific goods end up being taxed or not, that uncertainty makes it really hard for businesses to plan ahead. And it's even harder for retailers or wholesalers than it is for manufacturers who need to order and deliver hundreds or thousands of components across their global supply chains. Here to explain some of those challenges and maybe suggest some solutions is our guest this week. He's Matthew Haber, the CEO and co-founder of Cofactr. Welcome, Matthew.
Thank you for having me.
Matthew, to start us off, maybe you could give us a quick introduction to our listeners about Cofactr and just let them know what sort of role the company plays in this discussion.
Yeah, so Cofactr is essentially data intelligence, source to pay, and materials management platform used primarily by what we call critical manufacturers. So the folks who work with us tend to be building very sort of complex, high value products with a lot of components going into them, often sophisticated global supply chains. So think aerospace and defense, medical device manufacturing, automotive industries like that. And so we provide tools and related infrastructure that helps those companies construct and operate their supply chains.
Gotcha. And so that sounds like a complex job in the best of times, but facing these fast changing conditions that we've been in the last few weeks and months, how can manufacturers even accurately classify that big wide range of products? Because they're the ones who need to calculate tariffs on each of the individual components, right?
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, I think folks are often jumping straight to the conversation around tariff mitigation. How do we restructure our supply chains to avoid tariffs? But really, the first step is even just understanding what is the classifications and what are the country of origin of all the parts going into your product today, right? And that sort of ground truth is step one. And you're right that can be really challenging for folks with a lot of parts going into their assemblies. I think there's a couple things there. One is there is no magic bullet. I'm not here to tell people that they can just like magically solve this problem tomorrow, but there are tools and processes that can help. One of them is you can go to companies that already have a lot of that data. So Cofactr, in particular for electronic components, has data on HTS codes, so the classifications, as well as the country of origin for tens of millions of unique components out there, and that could really help. There are other companies out there that as well like operate sort of data sets for that kind of information. That can be a real shortcut. And the other crucial piece is, in a lot of cases, manufacturers already have that information in their possession. It's just not readily accessible to them. So a simple example would be packing slips that come from their suppliers. If they've been purchasing that part in the past, it's very likely that they have paperwork somewhere, whether it's a physical file cabinet or a SharePoint drive or some sort of server. But there's probably scans of PDFs somewhere with HTS codes, country of origin, things like that, because they needed that the last time those materials came through customs. But a lot of folks just don't store that somewhere central. It just kind of comes and goes on those PDFs. And Cofactr, as well as some other companies, provide products, in our case, it's called Doc AI, that can essentially securely go and scrape through all of that information and extract all that data out of the paperwork they probably already have and put that into one nice clean data set that they can then start using, in days to build a much clearer picture of where their materials are actually coming from and what the classifications are.
Oh, interesting. So a lot of the information might already be there in each company's files. It sounds like a lot of this process just involves paperwork. So do manufacturers also need to prepare documentation for customs checks when they go through the process?
Yeah, I mean that someone certainly does. So, manufacturers are either doing that themselves or they are reliant on their suppliers to do it and hoping that their suppliers do it correctly. And ultimately there's a customs agent or customs broker in the middle that's sort of checking and submitting that paperwork. But your customs brokers don't know where your parts are coming from and don't know what your parts are unless you tell them. So when there's sort of nuanced questions about how does an item need to be classified, certainly a customs broker or trade attorneys are going to be the experts to help with determining the vague differences between two kinds of widgets. But at a high level, yeah, manufacturers have to know that information and have to be able to accurately provide it upstream in the supply chain as the importer of record. And it is incumbent on them to have that and have it in a kind of like useful, efficient way if they want to be able to operate a smooth running supply chain.
Right. And, to some extent, of course, there have always been tariffs in certain areas, but it's more complicated than just that top line fee because there are also strict regulations on more detailed stuff, I guess you'd say, like duty drawbacks and temporary import bonding and de minimis exemptions. Some of these things have hit the headlines in recent weeks, but outside of specialists, I'm not sure a lot of us even know exactly what they are.
Yeah, it is funny. Like duty drawbacks in particular have been sort of all the rage as a conversation topic of late, which is funny because they're not a new thing, and they've been around for, as far as I know, decades, and certainly they were something we've been aware of, but we are certainly talking about them a whole lot more of late than we used to. And I think these are all ultimately what I'd sort of call tariff mitigation methodologies, right? So they're not avoidance. You're not changing your supply chain necessarily to get around tariffs. Certainly, you're not misclassifying things or doing things to avoid tariffs illegally, which we would never recommend. But there are a swath of these sort of legal measures depending on the nature of your supply chain. So, where you import stuff from, where it's going, what you're doing with it while it's in the US in particular, that can help manufacturers avoid paying all of the tariffs that they otherwise would have paid, and in fact, they're sort of legally not required to pay when they use these tools. So drawbacks in particular are a method in which materials that are imported into a country that offers duty drawbacks, the US in particular, can be refunded or mostly refunded later if those materials are re-exported or incorporated into a product that's re-exported. And so, a simple example would be if you build cars in the US, you pay a bunch of tariffs when you import, a tire from another country. But if that whole car then gets re-exported to, let's say, Canada to be sold in Canada, you can actually get back the tariffs you paid on the materials on those tires when you imported them into the US. The government will give you back, 90+% of those tariffs later. But there are somewhat sophisticated paperwork requirements that you have to have in place to be able to actually claim those. And so I think that's something that all of a sudden folks are paying a lot of attention to is how do they actually implement the proper controls and systems to be able to avail themselves of these opportunities.
That's really interesting. So, knowledge is power on this. And we talked about mitigation once or twice. Can manufacturers mitigate the impact as we see some of these newly imposed tariffs on U.S. imports just by that knowledge, by that end-to-end visibility of their supply chains?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that won't solve all problems, right? So if you're buying a part from China, incorporating to a product that you're selling in the US, there's not really much of a way around that other than changing where you source that part from, right? So there's no loophole, there's no legal loophole certainly that's gonna mean you don't have to pay that tariff from China. And if you're selling the finished good into the US market, sort of none of those like duty drawback options are going to be available to you. So, the visibility is not like is not some magic tool that just like makes tariffs go away. But there's a broad swath of sort of activities that manufacturers can engage in that legally mean they should not have to pay these tariffs, but the only way to not pay them is to have fairly extensive sort of end-to-end visibility and paperwork controls. Otherwise, you can't really prove that you fall into the classification that would allow you to not have to pay those tariffs, right? So the paperwork process is very much incumbent on the manufacturer to have the correct controls in place to not pay the tariffs. It's not the other way around, right? It's not the government isn't the one who has to prove you have to pay the tariffs. You have to prove you don't have to pay them.
Got it. So interesting. Matthew, I learned a lot from our talk today. I really appreciate your coming on the show this week.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Our guest this week has been Matthew Haber from Cofactr. Back to you, Dave.
Thank you, Matthew and Ben. Now let's take a look at some of the other supply chain news from the week. Victoria, the COVID pandemic taught supply chain professionals about the importance of being resilient. And now that tariffs and the trade wars are upon us, that experience is coming in very handy. And you wrote this week about how they're better prepared now to handle disruptions. Can you tell us more?
Yeah, that's right, Dave. So, a study out this week confirms that some of the actions supply chain professionals have taken in recent years to really build up their company's resilience have worked, as you say. So, most companies say they are confident in their ability to manage disruptions these days. So, that's good news. However, a good portion of those supply chain professionals also point to some lingering problems, particularly when it comes to supply chain visibility. This was a study by the information standards company GS1 US, which is probably best known as the administrator of the Universal Product Code, or UPC barcodes. The study's titled Powering Supply Chain Confidence, the Role of Data and Standardization, and it's based on a national survey of more than 500 supply chain professionals. Those professionals ranged from directors to C-level executives across a range of industries. Virtually all of them, it was like 99%, said they were either highly confident or moderately confident in their ability to manage supply chain disruptions. But 43% said they struggled to maintain supply chain visibility. And that's a factor the authors concluded opens the door to risk despite the strong attitudes about resilience.
That's interesting, Victoria. What are the successful companies doing? Was there any information on best practices, for instance?
Yes. So the study found that supply chain confidence is closely tied to operational capabilities that strengthen supply chain management. So the companies that said they have high confidence in their resilience either do or have a few things. One is a centralized system to manage disruption in real time. More than half said they have that in place. Another was full supply chain automation. More than 70% said they do that, which seemed impressive to me. And they say that gives them the ability to manage supply chain agility very well. And the final is use of I should say there were other issues, but the third one I'll mention is the use of standards. In this case, the GS1 standards. It's that group that did the study. So they asked about their own standards, of course. And respondents said that makes them confident in their ability to respond to all these disruptions. The report also digs into some other interesting issues and trends, one of which is sustainability. Listeners can access the full report from our story.
Right. And I think being resilient can really be the difference between just surviving and being able to thrive this year.
Yes, absolutely.
Thanks, Victoria.
You're welcome.
And Ben, sticking with the new fees and tariffs theme that we've had during this podcast, you wrote this week about some new fees being levied on Chinese cargo ships coming into U.S. ports. Can you share what types of fees they are and the rationale behind imposing them?
Yeah, exactly. That's been the conversation this week. So these are distinct from tariffs, which are fees collected by U.S. Customs and Border Patrol on certain goods or from certain countries. These new fees are levied by the Trump administration on global trade that will start in October. And it would work by affecting cargo vessels and container ships that are built or owned or operated by Chinese companies. This came from the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and it falls under something called Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. Our listeners may have heard of Section 301 in reference to this. And the White House says this has to do with unfair foreign practices affecting U.S. commerce and companies. In the words of the U.S. Trade Representative, who is Ambassador Jameson Greer, he said that the Trump administration's actions will begin to reverse Chinese dominance, address threats to the U.S. supply chain, and send a demand signal for U.S.-built ships.
Well, Ben, I can see some sense in trying to level things, and many countries outside of China have complained for a long time about some of these Chinese practices. But what does the industry think about this latest policy?
Yeah, they do not like it. While companies and trade groups operating in that sector, many of them say they endorse some of those goals, as you just said. Some of these things and unfair trade practices have been things that U.S. companies complained about for decades, really. But they disagree with the White House strategy to achieve those changes and goals. For one thing, they say that to jumpstart the domestic shipbuilding sector, which means encouraging U.S. companies to build container ships here in the U.S., is an initiative that would take decades to even begin. And if it happened, they say it would result in more expensive boats than the ones that are currently available. For another thing, they point out that this new Section 301 policy would affect not only the ships, but also cargo handling equipment like containers and chassis and those enormous ship to shore container cranes. So even if we got there, they say the effort would undermine American trade and hurt U.S. producers and weaken efforts to actually strengthen the nation's maritime industry, which is sort of the opposite of what the intent is here. In the words of the American Association of Port Authorities, which is the trade group, of course, for ports, they said America's ports appreciate the Trump administration's willingness to incorporate the industry's concerns in their effort to counter China's dominance in the maritime space. So again, they agree with the concept. But the policy here will, in the Port Authority Group's eyes, drive up the cost of shipping, reduce the volume coming through U.S. trade gateways, and make goods, especially automobiles, more expensive for American consumers. And for a slightly different point of view, the World Shipping Council, which is the trade group for the international container ship industry, had a similar stance. They said likewise that they shared some of the White House's goals here, but they suggested what they called more constructive pathways to reach them. So, for example, the World Shipping Council suggested policies like targeted investment incentives, infrastructure improvements, and streamlined regulatory processes. So in the WSC's view, they said those steps can deliver some of the benefits we've been talking about without disrupting U.S. trade on the way.
Yeah, I think, Ben, history has proven that those other measures usually have better results than blanket tariffs and charges as ways of reducing competitive advantages.
It seems like it, but we'll keep reporting on whatever it is that we see out there.
Thank you, Ben.
Glad to.
We encourage listeners to go to dcvelocity.com for more on these and other supply chain stories. Also, check out the podcast notes section for some direct links to read more about the topics that we discussed today. And we'd like to thank Matthew Haber of Cofactr for being our guest. We welcome your comments on this topic and our other stories. You can email us at podcast@agilebme.com. We also encourage you to subscribe to Logistics Matters at your favorite podcast platform. Our new episodes are uploaded on Fridays. And a reminder that Logistics Matters is sponsored by ID Label. Have a new warehouse project, WMS conversion, reconfiguration, or a new facility? ID Label is here to help. ID Label manufactures durable labels and signs for your warehouse, and their in-house team also installs them. Visit idlabelinc.com to request a free label sample pack for your next project. ID Label. When we do the barcodes, you can do more. We'll be back again next week with another edition of Logistics Matters. Be sure to join us. Until then, have a great week.